April 1975, St. Louis, Missouri. Workers at the Falstaff Brewery haul the American flag down from its pole, then raise it again, upside down at half staff. The international distress signal, the sign of mourning, both at once. 10 years earlier, Falstaff Brewing Corporation produced over 7 million barrels of beer a year, third largest in the nation, plants in 10 cities, a name on the New York Stock Exchange, a Shakespearean night on every can. Now a man from Poland has signed a $20 million check to buy what's left, and his first act is to fire almost everyone in the building. But this story does not begin with a corporate raid. It begins underground, in the limestone caves beneath St. Louis, where a German immigrant brewed a kind of beer America had never tasted. It passes through a mansion haunted by 4 suicides, through a brand sold for $25,000 by a man who would be dead within 2 years, through Prohibition, a Supreme Court case, and the longest collapse in American brewing history. 2 families built this empire, 1 man destroyed it, and the flag never flew right side up again. St. Louis, Missouri, 1838 to 2005. In 1838, a brewer named Johann Adam Lemp stepped off a boat and into St. Louis with nothing but a trade skill and a recipe the country had never seen. He was born in 1798 in Eschwege, Germany, where he learned the ancient craft of lagering, a slow, cold fermentation process that produced beer lighter, crisper, and more refreshing than anything Americans were drinking. At the time, the United States knew only English-style ales and porters, dark, heavy, warm fermented. Lemp carried in his head a different idea of what beer could be. He started small, a grocery store at 6th and Morgan Street, selling vinegar, dry goods, and his own beer on the side. The site today sits buried beneath the south end of the dome at America's center. No plaque marks it. No sign tells you that the American lager revolution began in a grocer's back room. But the beer sold. German immigrants flooding into St. Louis in the 1840s recognized the taste of home immediately, and word spread. Within 2 years, Lemp abandoned the grocery business entirely and built the Western Brewery at 37 South 2nd Street, roughly where the south leg of the Gateway Arch now stands. Another landmark erased by progress. What gave Lemp his true advantage was not skill alone. It was geology. St. Louis sits atop a vast network of natural limestone caves, carved by water over millennia, holding a constant cool temperature year-round. Lager requires cold storage during fermentation, and in an era before mechanical refrigeration, those caves were worth more than gold. Lemp moved his aging barrels underground and let the earth do what no machine yet could. The beer that emerged was unlike anything on the American market. Clean, bright, effervescent. Where ales were thick and murky, Lemp's lager was golden and sharp. St. Louis drank it as fast as he could brew it. By 1850, the Western Brewery was profitable. By the time Adam Lemp died in 1862, he was a millionaire. His son, William J. Lemp Sr., inherited the fortune and the ambition. In 1864, he built a massive new brewery complex at Cherokee Street and Carondelet Avenue, stretching it eventually across 13 city blocks. The Lemp Brewery became the largest in St. Louis, larger at that point than even the upstart Anheuser-Busch operation a few miles away. William Sr. built the family mansion at 3122 South 13th Street, right next to the brewery, and connected the two with tunnels running through the same limestone caves his father had used to age beer. He could walk from his bedroom to the brew house without ever seeing daylight. By 1870, the Lemp name was synonymous with St. Louis wealth and power. The family owned the largest brewery in the city, lived in one of its grandest homes, and stored their fortune in caves that ran so deep beneath the streets that eyeless fish swam in the underground pools, and a lit match would sputter out for lack of oxygen. In 1903, the brewery gave a name to its most popular brand. They chose a character from Shakespeare, Sir John Falstaff, the fat, jolly knight from Henry IV, a lover of wine, women, and laughter, a man who never took life too seriously. The marketing logic was simple. Beer should feel like fun. The name Falstaff was stamped onto bottles and sent across the country, and for a brief window, It looked like the Lemp dynasty might ride that cheerful night into the 20th century unchallenged. But William Lemp Sr. was not a cheerful man. Not anymore. As his empire grew, he retreated deeper into the tunnels beneath his mansion, avoiding the outside world, walking to work and back through the dark underground passageways. His neighbors saw him less and less. His family saw the signs but said nothing. Something was building in the limestone dark beneath the city, beneath the brewery, beneath the mansion, beneath the fortune, something that had nothing to do with beer. And in 1901, it surfaced. On December 12th, 1901, Frederick Lemp, 28 years old, brewery superintendent, the son William Sr. had chosen above all others to carry the empire forward, died of sudden heart failure. The cause was listed as complications from unnamed diseases. No further explanation was ever given. The heir apparent was gone before he had the chance to lead. William Lemp Sr. never recovered. He had built a 13-block brewery, amassed a fortune, and connected his mansion to his empire through tunnels carved into the earth. But the loss of Frederick hollowed him out. He withdrew further into the underground passages. He stopped appearing at public functions. He barely spoke. On January 1st, 1904, his closest friend, Frederick Pabst, the Milwaukee brewing magnate, died. 6 weeks later, on the morning of February 13th, 1904, William Lemp Sr. excused himself from the breakfast table in his mansion at 3322 South 13th Street, walked upstairs to his second-floor bedroom, and shot himself in the head with a .38 caliber revolver. He left no note, no explanation. His family found him when he failed to come back down. The eldest surviving son, William Jr., took control. He was capable enough as a businessman, and under his watch the brewery continued to expand. By 1910, Lemp Brewing produced over 900,000 barrels a year. But Billy Lemp, as St. Louis knew him, was not his father. He drank heavily. He spent lavishly. His wife, Lillian, known as the Lavender Lady for her custom-made purple dresses and her fleet of lavender, horse-drawn carriages, dragged their failing marriage through a spectacular public divorce trial covered by 4 St. Louis newspapers simultaneously. Then Prohibition arrived. The 18th Amendment in 1919 shut down every legal brewery in America, but few closures were as total as Lemp's. Unlike Anheuser-Busch, which pivoted to ice cream, yeast, and malt syrup, William Jr. simply gave up. He looked at the numbers, looked at the law, and closed the doors. In June 1922, he announced the sale of the entire Lemp Brewery complex, 13 city blocks of buildings, equipment, caves, and infrastructure once valued at $7 million. At auction, it sold for $588,000, 8 cents on the dollar for an empire his father had spent a lifetime building. The family crumbled in sequence. In March 1920, Elsa Lemp Wright, William Sr.'s youngest daughter, considered the wealthiest heiress in St. Louis, shot herself in bed at her home on Hortense Place. Her husband was in the next room. On December 29, 1922, months after the auction, William Jr. dismissed his secretary from his office at the mansion, placed a revolver against his chest, and fired. He was 55. The mansion sat quiet for decades after that, until Charles Lemp, unmarried, reclusive, increasingly bitter, moved back in with his German shepherd, Serva, and a pair of servants. His brother Edwin begged him not to. The house was no place for the living, Edwin said. Charles ignored him. On May 10, 1949, Charles shot his dog in the basement, climbed upstairs, and shot himself in a room adjoining the one where his brother had done the same 27 years earlier. He was the only Lemp to leave a note. It said, "In case I am found dead, blame it on no one but me." 4 suicides across 3 generations, a brewery sold for scrap, a mansion that would later be named one of the 10 most haunted locations in America by Life magazine. But in the wreckage, one small transaction changed everything. In 1920, the same year his sister Elsa died, the same year Prohibition shut him down, William Lemp Jr. sat across from his friend Joseph Griesedick in that same office and agreed to sell him the rights to the Falstaff brand name. The price was $25,000, a rounding error on a dead empire. 2 years later, Billy Lemp killed himself in the room where the deal was signed. Joseph Griesedeek, Papa Joe as his family called him, came from Stromberg, Germany, just a short drive from Adolphus Busch's hometown. His family had been brewing beer since the 18th century. He had arrived in St. Louis in 1866, worked his way through the malting and brewing trades, and purchased the Forest Park Brewing Company in 1917. He renamed it the Griesedeek Beverage Company and prepared to survive the dry years. Now with a dead man's brand in his pocket, Papa Joe saw what no one else could see. Not a name cursed by tragedy, not a label tainted by suicide and failure. He saw a word that Americans already knew: Falstaff, the merry knight, the lover of life. And he saw a future. He renamed his company the Falstaff Brewing Corporation, and he began to build. Papa Joe Griesedeek understood one thing that most brewers in 1920 did not. Prohibition was not a death sentence. It was a test. And the test was not about beer. It was about whether you could keep your people employed, your equipment running, and your name alive long enough for the law to change. Most brewers failed that test. Hundreds of breweries across the country locked their doors the day the 18th Amendment took effect and never reopened. The Lemp family, as the world had just seen, collapsed entirely. But Papa Joe had no intention of disappearing. His first move was practical. The Falstaff Brewing Corporation, freshly renamed, freshly branded, could not sell beer, so it sold everything else. Near beer, marketed under the Falstaff name. Soft drinks, cured hams. If it could carry a label, Papa Joe put the Falstaff Knight on it and shipped it out the door. His second move was technical, and it made all the difference. Most breweries producing near beer used a crude method called check fermentation. Halting the brewing process just before the alcohol content exceeded the legal limit of 0.5%. The result tasted like what it was: unfinished beer. Flat, sour, and vaguely embarrassing. Papa Joe refused. Like Anheuser-Busch across town, Falstaff brewed its beer through the full fermentation cycle. The same process, the same ingredients, the same care as real beer, and then ran the finished product through a special de-alcoholizer machine that stripped the alcohol out at the end. The difference in taste was enormous. Falstaff's near beer tasted like beer that had simply lost its punch. Everyone else's tasted like a mistake. This decision seemed minor at the time. It would prove to be the single most important choice the company made during Prohibition. Because when the law changed, Falstaff would not need months to retool. The brewhouse was already running. The recipes were already dialed in. The only adjustment was switching off the de-alcoholizer. For 13 years, Falstaff held on. Papa Joe kept workers employed. He kept the brand visible. He kept the machinery warm. And he waited. On April 7, 1933, the wait ended. President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Cullen-Harrison Act, legalizing beer with up to 3.2% alcohol by weight, effective at midnight. Across America, breweries scrambled to restart dormant equipment, rehire scattered workers, and produce something drinkable. Most needed weeks. Falstaff needed hours. The de-alcoholizer went silent. The full-strength beer, already in the pipeline, flowed straight into barrels. Before dawn on April 8th, the first two cases rolled off the line. They were loaded onto a plane at nearby Curtis Steinberg Airport and airlifted. One to the governor of Missouri, one to the governor of Illinois. It was a publicity stunt, and it was brilliant. While other breweries were still sweeping dust off their kettles, Falstaff was already making headlines. The company emerged from Prohibition leaner, smarter, and hungrier than it had any right to be. Papa Joe's son Alvin stepped into an expanding leadership role, and together they began plotting something no regional brewer had ever attempted: a national expansion built not by constructing new plants, but by buying old ones. And then Papa Joe did something truly radical. He took Falstaff public. In an industry where families guarded ownership like a birthright, where the Busches, the Pabsts, the Schlitzes, and the Millers held their shares behind closed doors, Falstaff listed on the New York Stock Exchange. It was one of the first major breweries in America to do so. The move brought in capital that family savings alone could never match. It gave Falstaff the financial muscle to buy competitors. It signaled to Wall Street and to the industry that this company intended to grow fast and grow far. By the late 1930s, that growth had already begun. In 1936, Falstaff purchased the Krug Brewery in Omaha, Nebraska. It was a modest acquisition by later standards, but it carried an enormous symbolic weight. Falstaff became the first American brewery to operate plants in two different states. The age of the multi-plant brewer had arrived, and Falstaff had fired the starting gun. Papa Joe Graysadek had taken a dead man's brand, a $25,000 receipt, and 13 years of dessert, and turned them into a company trading on the New York Stock Exchange with breweries in two states and ambitions that stretched to every corner of the country. The desert was over. The empire was just beginning. The logic was simple, and for a while it was brilliant. Building a new brewery from scratch cost millions of dollars and years of construction. But all across America, small regional breweries were struggling, squeezed by competition, weakened by Prohibition's long hangover, unable to modernize. They had buildings, they had equipment, they had distribution networks, and they could be bought for a fraction of what it would cost to start from nothing. Papa Joe and his son, Alvin Graysadek, saw this clearly. If Falstaff could not outproduce Anheuser-Busch barrel for barrel from a single plant in St. Louis, it could match them in reach by scattering production across the country, brewing Falstaff beer closer to the customers who drank it, cutting transportation costs, and planting the flag in every major region of the United States. The Krug Brewery in Omaha was the first. In 1937, Falstaff acquired the National Brewing Company of New Orleans, pushing into the Deep South. In the 1950s, the pace accelerated. The Berghoff Brewing Company in Fort Wayne, Indiana, came in 1954. The Galveston-Houston Brewing Company in Texas followed in 1956, along with the Mitchell Brewing Company in El Paso. A plant in San Jose, California, opened the Western Front. In St. Louis alone, Falstaff operated 4 separate facilities. Plant number 1 through plant number 5, scattered across the city, each one a former competitor absorbed into the growing machine. At the Continental Building in Grand Center, the tallest skyscraper in the neighborhood, Falstaff occupied the top floors, looking down over the city that had made them. Later, as the company outgrew even that, they built a dedicated headquarters at 5050 Oakland Avenue. Alvin Graysadek, by now the driving force behind the expansion, purchased a home at 19 Squires Lane in Huntley, one of the wealthiest enclaves in the St. Louis suburbs. His neighbors were the Von Gontards and other members of the Anheuser-Busch aristocracy. The two brewing dynasties lived across the street from each other, their children attending the same schools, their fortunes rising on the same tide. The Graysadek sons were sent to Cornell University. No one in the family went to a party school. This was a dynasty that took itself seriously, that saw education as part of the machinery of empire. Monsignor Edward Graysadek, Papa Joe's grandson, still remembered decades later what it was like to work in the Falstaff warehouse as a young man, hauling cases before moving upstairs to the corporate offices where his job, as he put it with characteristic frankness, was hiring secretaries. The priesthood called him away at 28 in 1958. He left the brewery but never stopped watching. His nephew Joseph Graysadek Jr., Joe Jr., stayed. He climbed through the ranks and would eventually become the last Graysadek to serve as president of Falstaff. He was smart, capable, and loyal to a fault. He believed in the company the way his grandfather had believed in it, not merely as a business, but as an obligation. The Graysadeks employed thousands of people. Those people had families. Those families had mortgages. You did not walk away from that. By the early 1960s, the acquisition machine had done exactly what it was designed to do. Falstaff operated plants in 10 cities across the country. Its beer was sold in dozens of states. Its name was recognized from the Gulf Coast to the Great Plains. The company was publicly traded, well-capitalized, and growing. But the machine had a flaw, and the flaw was the machine itself. Every brewery Falstaff bought was old. That was the point. Old breweries were cheap. But old breweries were also inefficient. They had outdated equipment, limited capacity, and maintenance costs that climbed higher every year. Each acquisition added production volume, but it also added another aging facility that needed constant reinvestment just to keep running. Anheuser-Busch had chosen the opposite path. Instead of buying a dozen small plants, they built a handful of enormous super breweries, modern, automated, designed from the ground up for maximum output at minimum cost. One Anheuser-Busch super brewery could outproduce 3 or 4 of Falstaff's aging plants combined at a fraction of the labor cost. Falstaff was winning the map, but Anheuser-Busch was winning the math. And in the brewing industry, the math always wins eventually. No one inside the Griestick family wanted to hear this. The plants were more than assets on a balance sheet. They were communities. Omaha, New Orleans, Fort Wayne, Galveston, El Paso. Each plant employed hundreds of workers. Each closing would devastate a town. The Griesticks had built their reputation on loyalty, on the idea that a brewery owed something to the people who made its beer. Shutting plants to improve efficiency felt like betrayal, so they kept them all open. They spread their capital thin. They maintained buildings that should have been replaced, and they told themselves that reach would be enough. It might have been if Falstaff had stopped there, if the company had consolidated, modernized what it had, and accepted its position as a strong regional giant, the story might have ended differently. But Falstaff did not stop, because in 1965, the board of directors looked at a map of the United States and saw one enormous blank space where Falstaff beer was not sold: the Northeast. And in that blank space, they saw a target. Her name was Narragansett. In 1965, the Falstaff Brewing Corporation produced 7,218 barrels of beer. It was the highest number the company would ever reach. Third in the nation, behind only Anheuser-Busch and the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company of Milwaukee. 10 plants, dozens of states, a publicly traded juggernaut with a Shakespearean night on every can and a jingle on every radio. That same year, the company hired Landor Associates, one of the most prestigious design firms in the world, to remake its image. Landor had built its reputation on what it called male-marketed products, and it approached beer the way a fashion house approached couture. Every detail mattered. The new Falstaff can emerge months later. A bold heraldic shield, a rampant lion, the name Falstaff in capital letters across a clean white background, gold stars above a blue banner. It was modern, masculine, and unmistakable on a store shelf. Landor stayed on as a permanent consultant, monitoring the brand like a doctor monitoring a heartbeat. On television, the heartbeat was even louder. Harry Carey, the legendary Chicago White Sox announcer, beloved for his gravelly voice and unapologetic enthusiasm, endorsed Falstaff in live commercials during broadcasts. He did not read from a script. He held a glass of Falstaff on camera, took a long sip, and told the audience it was the best beer in America. He meant it. Viewers believed him. For a brief golden window in the mid-1960s, Falstaff was not just a beer, it was a personality. But the board of directors was not satisfied with third place. The map on the wall in the 5050 Oakland Avenue headquarters showed a glaring absence. Falstaff sold beer in the Midwest, the South, the Southwest, and parts of the West Coast. It did not sell a single bottle in New England. Of the nation's 10 largest brewers in 1964, only Falstaff and 2 others had no presence in the Northeast. And Falstaff was the biggest of the 3, with the nearest plant in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The company had publicly stated for years that it intended to become a truly national brewer. National meant coast to coast. Coast to coast meant New England, and New England meant Narragansett. The Narragansett Brewing Company of Cranston, Rhode Island, was everything Falstaff needed. It was the largest seller of beer in New England, commanding roughly 20% of the regional market. It had a strong distribution network built over decades. Its slogan, "Hi neighbor, have a Gansett," was as familiar to New Englanders as the Red Sox, whose broadcasts Narragansett had sponsored since the days of announcer Kurt Godey. Buying Narragansett would hand Falstaff instant dominance in the one region it could not crack alone. On July 15, 1965, Falstaff purchased Narragansett for $17 million in cash and $2 million in Falstaff common stock, $19 million total, a bet the company wager that the Northeast would complete the national puzzle. 2 days earlier, the United States Department of Justice had filed an antitrust lawsuit to block the deal. The government's argument was straightforward. The New England beer market was already consolidating rapidly. The number of brewers operating plants in the region had fallen from 32 in 1935 to just 6 in 1964. The four largest sellers controlled over 61% of the market. Allowing the nation's third largest brewer to swallow the region's biggest player would accelerate that consolidation and reduce competition further. The government suggested that Falstaff should have entered New England on its own, either by shipping beer from Fort Wayne or by building a new plant in the region. Falstaff's management argued the opposite. They had studied every alternative: shipping from Indiana, constructing a new facility, acquiring a smaller brewery as a toehold, and concluded that none offered a reasonable probability of profitable entry. The only viable path was Narragansett. The court denied the government's request for a preliminary injunction, and Falstaff completed the purchase. But the lawsuit did not go away. It climbed through the federal court system for nearly a decade, reaching the United States Supreme Court in 1973 as United States versus Falstaff Brewing Corp. Justice Byron White, writing for the majority, reversed the lower court's ruling and sent the case back for reconsideration, finding that the trial court had applied the wrong legal standard in evaluating Falstaff as a potential competitor. In the end, Falstaff won. The district court ruled in its favor on remand in 1974, 9 years after the original purchase. But winning the case meant nothing. 9 years of legal uncertainty had paralyzed the integration. Falstaff was forced to operate Narragansett as a separate subsidiary throughout the litigation, unable to merge operations, unable to consolidate, unable to capture the efficiencies that had justified the acquisition in the first place. And while Falstaff sat in courtrooms, something far more damaging happened on the ground. In 1970, Anheuser-Busch opened a brand new, state-of-the-art brewery in Merrimack, New Hampshire, right in the heart of Narragansett's territory. It was exactly the kind of modern super brewery that Falstaff could not match. Automated, efficient, and backed by a national advertising budget that dwarfed anything a regional player could afford. The Merrimack plant began pouring Budweiser into New England like water through a broken dam. By the time Falstaff finally gained full legal control of Narragansett, the damage was irreversible. The Cranston plant was old, running at maximum capacity of roughly 1.7 million barrels per year, but its outdated equipment could not compete with Merrimack's output. Narragansett's market share, once 65% of the New England market, had already begun its long slide toward oblivion. Falstaff had bet $19 million on the Northeast. It had won the Supreme Court case, and it had lost everything the case was supposed to protect. 7 million barrels. That was the peak. The number would never climb again. Within 10 years, it would fall by 70%, and the wolves were already circling. The 1970s did not kill Falstaff. The 1970s killed almost everyone. In 1970, there were still over 100 brewing companies operating in the United States. By the end of the decade, nearly half of them would be gone, absorbed, bankrupted, or simply shut down as the industry consolidated with a speed and brutality that no one had fully predicted. Economists would later call it a mass extinction event, and the analogy was precise. The small and the slow died first, then the medium-sized, then even some of the giants. The most spectacular collapse belonged to Schlitz. The Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company of Milwaukee had been the second largest brewer in America, ahead of Falstaff, trailing only Anheuser-Busch. Its slogan, "The beer that made Milwaukee famous," was as embedded in the national vocabulary as Budweiser's crown. But in the early 1970s, Schlitz made a decision that would destroy the company from the inside out. To cut costs and increase production speed, Schlitz chemists replaced traditional brewing ingredients with cheaper substitutes: high fructose corn syrup instead of malted barley, hop pellets instead of whole hops, and a silica gel filtration process that was supposed to extend shelf life. The beer that emerged looked the same. It did not taste the same. Worse, the new formula sometimes produced a hazy, flaky sediment that floated visibly in the bottle. Consumers noticed immediately. Sales cratered. By the time Schlitz reversed course and returned to the original recipe, the brand was fatally wounded. The company that had once challenged Anheuser-Busch for the #1 position would be sold to Stroh's in 1982 for a fraction of its peak value. The beer that made Milwaukee famous had unmade itself. Falstaff watched Schlitz implode and took no comfort from it. The same forces crushing Schlitz were crushing everyone. National brewers could advertise on network television, spreading their costs across tens of millions of viewers. Regional brewers could not. National brewers could absorb a bad quarter in one market by leaning on strength in another. Regional brewers could not. National brewers could negotiate bulk discounts on cans, bottles, hops, and barley that smaller operations had no leverage to match. The economics of beer had tilted permanently in favor of scale, and Falstaff, despite its 10 plants and its coast-to-coast ambitions, was not scaled enough. Then came Ballantine. In 1972, Falstaff acquired the Ballantine beer brand from what remained of a once proud Newark, New Jersey, brewing operation. The idea was to strengthen the company's position in the Northeast, the same logic that had driven the Narragansett purchase 7 years earlier. But Ballantine proved to be a money pit. Sales declined relentlessly. Falstaff poured resources into advertising, distribution, and retail operations, maintaining a network of company-owned warehouses and delivery trucks that most brewers had long since replaced with independent distributors. By 1975, Falstaff claimed to have lost $22 million on Ballantine operations alone. $22 million burned in 3 years on a brand that was already fading when they bought it. Inside the company, Joe Griesdeek Jr. understood the mathematics better than anyone. He had risen to the presidency, the last member of the founding family to hold the title, and what he saw from that chair was terrifying. Falstaff was completely overleveraged. The company had no money to pay its creditors, who were now lining up for repayment. The aging plants his father and grandfather had acquired with such pride had become liabilities, each one an outdated facility hemorrhaging maintenance costs while producing beer at twice the per-barrel expense of a modern competitor. The Narragansett lawsuit had drained legal fees for 9 years. The Ballantine acquisition had drained everything else. Joe Jr. was not a fool. He could read a balance sheet, but he was a Griesdeek, and Griesdeeks did not abandon their people. The family still held significant stock in the company, stock that was plummeting in value month after month. Monsignor Edward Griesdeek, watching from his parish, later recalled that the family held on not because they expected a recovery, but because selling would have felt like a betrayal. Their workers had given Falstaff decades of labor. Their communities depended on those plants for jobs. Dumping stock to save personal wealth while the employees went down with the ship was not something a Griesdeek could do. So they held, and the stock kept falling. Boatman's Bank, Falstaff's primary lender in St. Louis, delivered the final verdict. The company needed a massive capital infusion, or it would not survive. $20 million minimum. The Griesdeeks did not have it. The public markets would not provide it. No major brewer wanted to acquire a company dragging 10 aging plants and 2 bleeding brands behind it. There was, however, one man who had the money. One man who had spent 25 years building a quiet empire of cheap breweries and cheaper operating costs on the West Coast. One man who, in 1958, had been threatened by Falstaff itself, told to sell his Los Angeles operation or be buried. He had not forgotten. Paul Kalmanovitz picked up the phone. Paul Kalmanovitz was not the kind of man who explained himself. He was born on December 27, 1905, in Łódź, Poland, into a Jewish family that would not survive the century intact. When World War I ended, the young Paul emigrated to Egypt, where he worked for the British military under General Edmund Allenby. His father, mother, and brothers stayed behind in Łódź. He would not learn what happened to most of them until decades later. Kalmanovitz arrived in the United States in 1926 by jumping off a merchant marine ship. No visa, no papers, no connections. He worked odd jobs, drifting through the orbits of powerful men, including Franklin Roosevelt, William Randolph Hearst, and Louis B. Mayer at MGM. He learned English. He learned money. And he learned that in America, you could own things that no one could take away from you if you were willing to be harder than the people trying to take them. In 1945, a letter arrived from his niece, Sonia, the daughter of his eldest brother, Joseph. The family in Łódź had been consumed by the Holocaust. His brother Stanislas had survived Auschwitz. Barely. Kalmanovitz arranged to bring Stanislas to the United States, paying whatever was required to extract a concentration camp survivor from post-war Europe. But he never spoke publicly about this. For the rest of his life, Paul Kalmanovitz denied being Jewish. He denied having surviving relatives. He built his identity on the principle that the past was a country he had burned behind him, and he would not look back. By 1950, he had entered the brewing industry, acquiring the struggling Meyer Brewing Company in Los Angeles. He introduced a new brand, Brew 102, and turned the operation profitable within a year. In 1958, Falstaff Brewing Corporation came calling. They wanted to buy Meyer to establish a California presence. When Kalmanovitz refused, Falstaff's representatives delivered a threat: sell or we will bury you. Kalmanovitz did not sell, he did not forget. And over the next 17 years, while Falstaff expanded, overspent, and bled out, he quietly built the General Brewing Company, absorbing Lucky Lager, the Walters Brewery in Pueblo, and the ABC Brewery in Los Angeles, all under his holding company, the S&P Corporation. He ran his breweries the way he ran everything else: minimum staff, minimum spending, maximum extraction. His employees called him Mr. Paul. They did not call him that with affection. In 1974, Falstaff, desperate for cash, drowning in debt from Narragansett and Ballantyne, unable to meet its payroll, sold its San Francisco brewery to Kalmanovitz's General Brewing Corporation. It was a lifeline disguised as a transaction. Kalmanovitz paid cash and agreed to continue producing Falstaff beer at the plant. But the real play was already forming. On March 10, 1975, Kalmanovitz entered into a formal agreement with Falstaff's board of directors. He would invest $10 million in cash and personally guarantee another $10 million in bank loans. In return, he would receive a new class of preferred stock that gave him majority voting control over the entire company. The Griesdeck family, which had built Falstaff from a $25,000 brand name into the third largest brewer in America, would retain their shares but lose their voice. The math was elegant: $10 million for an empire. Joe Griesdeck Jr. was in San Francisco at the time, assigned there by the company before the takeover. He was not in the room when the deal closed. Monsignor Edward Griesdeck, back in St. Louis, remembered the family's understanding of the arrangement. Kalmanovitz was a savior, an investor who would inject capital and let the business continue operating as it had. The Griesdecks believed they would keep their jobs, their roles, their dignity. Boatman's Bank had told them there was no alternative. They signed. They were wrong about everything except the last part. There was no alternative. In April 1975, Paul Kalmanovitz took control of the Falstaff Brewing Corporation. The first sign came at the headquarters at 5050 Oakland Avenue. Within days of the takeover, Kalmanovitz fired the majority of the 175 corporate office employees. Not in waves, not with transition periods. The termination was sudden, systematic, and total. Managers who had spent decades with the company arrived at work to find their positions eliminated. When the severance checks were issued, some of them bounced. The company's new owner, a man worth tens of millions of dollars, had written separation payments on an account that could not cover them. A for sale sign appeared on the 5050 Oakland Avenue building. The contact number was in San Francisco. Anyone who needed to reach the new management of Falstaff Brewing Corporation would have to call across the country. St. Louis, the city where Falstaff had been born, built and headquartered for over 50 years, was no longer relevant. The Griesdeck family was next. Kalmanovitz removed them from their positions. The family that had bought the brand from a suicidal William Lemp, nursed it through Prohibition, taken it public, and expanded it to 10 plants. Joe Jr. survived the purge only because he was already stationed in San Francisco, beyond the immediate reach of the layoffs. He watched from 3,000 miles away as the company his grandfather had built was stripped of everything that had made it more than a machine for extracting profit. At the brewery in St. Louis, plant number 10 on Gravois Avenue, the last operational Falstaff facility in the city, the workers understood what was happening before the press releases confirmed it. The news came not through official channels, but through the factory floor grapevine, the way bad news always travels in a plant, whispered between shifts, confirmed by a foreman's silence, made real by the look on a supervisor's face when he has nothing left to say. Someone climbed to the roof. The American flag was lowered from the pole. Then it was raised again, upside down, at half-staff. In the international language of maritime distress, an inverted flag means one thing: we are in danger. We need help. At half-staff, it means something else. Someone has died. The workers at the Falstaff Brewery were saying both. No help came. Kalmanovitz moved with the efficiency of a man who had done this before and intended to do it again. He slashed the advertising budget. The campaigns that had put Harry Carey on television with a glass of Falstaff, the Landor-designed branding that had made the shield and lion recognizable across the country, all of it reduced to nearly nothing. He cut maintenance spending at every plant. He eliminated quality control programs. He stopped investing in equipment upgrades. Every dollar that had previously gone into building the brand or maintaining the product now went directly to the bottom line. And for the first time in years, Falstaff showed a profit. This was Kalmanovitz's method, perfected at Meyer, refined at General Brewing, and now applied at industrial scale. Buy a dying company, fire the people, cut the spending, sell the assets, extract the profit. Move on. The beer got worse. The customers disappeared. The plants closed. But the ledger was black, and Paul Kalmanovitz was richer. The Securities and Exchange Commission eventually took notice. The SEC filed suit against both Falstaff and Kalmanovitz personally, alleging violations of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, specifically failure to disclose material corporate events, large asset dispositions, and other information required by law. A federal judge found that both defendants had violated the act and issued injunctions. Kalmanovitz paid the fines. He did not change his methods. Joe Jr. watched it all from San Francisco. He understood now what the family had missed. That Kalmanovitz had never intended to save Falstaff. He had intended to harvest it. The $20 million investment was not a rescue. It was a purchase price for the right to dismantle a 60-year-old company piece by piece, plant by plant, worker by worker, and sell the parts for more than he had paid for the whole. Monsignor Grisadik, from his parish in St. Louis, reflected on the moral question that would haunt the family for decades. Was Kalmanovitz a villain, or was he simply the man willing to do the work that the Grisadiks could not bring themselves to do? Close the plants, fire the workers, face the reality that the brewing industry had no room for a company built on loyalty instead of efficiency? The flag on the St. Louis plant eventually came down, not because someone fixed it, because in 1977 the plant closed permanently and there was no one left to raise a flag at all. Kalmanovitz did not close all the plants at once. He closed them in order, the least efficient first, then the next, then the next, like a man putting out candles in a long hallway, walking steadily toward the dark. St. Louis went first. The Gravois Avenue plant, the last Falstaff brewery in the city where the company had been born, shut down in 1977. The building where workers had flown the flag upside down just 2 years earlier fell silent. No announcement ceremony, no farewell. The equipment was sold. The workers were let go. The city that had given Falstaff its name, its identity, and its first barrels of beer was erased from the company's map as if it had never mattered at all. San Francisco followed in 1978. The very plant that Kalmanovitz had purchased from Falstaff in 1974, the transaction that had first opened the door between predator and prey, was deemed expendable barely 4 years later. Whatever beer it had been producing was shifted elsewhere or simply discontinued. New Orleans closed in 1979. The National Brewing Company plant that Falstaff had acquired back in 1937, one of Papa Joe Grisadek's earliest and proudest purchases, the anchor of Falstaff's presence in the Deep South for over 40 years, went dark. The workers who had spent careers brewing Falstaff on the Gulf Coast walked out of a building their fathers had walked into. In 1981, 2 plants died in the same year. Cranston, Rhode Island, the Narragansett Brewery, the prize that had cost Falstaff $19 million, a Supreme Court case, 9 years of litigation, and ultimately its independence, closed on July 31st. 350 workers lost their jobs in a single day. The equipment was disassembled, crated, and shipped to Zhaoqing, China, where it was reassembled and reopened as a Pabst brewery. The machines that had brewed beer for New England for nearly a century would spend their remaining years brewing beer for Guangdong province. That same year, the Galveston plant, built in 1895 by the Galveston Brewing Company, acquired by Falstaff in 1956, once producing 1 million barrels per year with over 400 employees, locked its doors for the last time. Omaha fell in 1983. The Krug Brewery, Falstaff's first acquisition outside Missouri, the plant that had made it the first American brewer to operate in 2 states, was abandoned. The building that had symbolized Falstaff's national ambition in 1936 became another empty shell on another quiet street. By the mid-1980s, only one Falstaff brewery remained in operation anywhere in the country. The Berghoff plant in Fort Wayne, Indiana, acquired in 1954. Everything else was gone. 10 plants reduced to 1. Thousands of jobs erased. An entire network of communities that had depended on Falstaff paychecks for decades left to find other ways to survive. Paul Kalmanovitz did not live to see the final closure. On January 17, 1987, he died at the age of 81. His estate was valued at approximately $1.2 billion, built on real estate, brewing, and the relentless extraction of value from companies other people had created. His will directed that the fortune be placed into a charitable foundation to fund hospitals and universities. The man who had destroyed thousands of jobs, gutted historic brands, and stripped American communities of their economic anchors would spend eternity funding medical research and higher education. The irony required no commentary. At the news of his death, his employees raised glasses of Jack Daniels, not Falstaff, not any of the beers he had owned, and offered a toast. Ding dong, the king is dead. After Kalmanovitz was gone, another secret surfaced. Throughout his life, he had denied being Jewish. He had denied having any surviving relatives. Both statements were lies. His brother Stanislas, the Auschwitz survivor he had rescued in 1945, was still alive. Paul had maintained a relationship with him privately while publicly erasing him from existence. Whatever had happened to Paul Kalmanovitz in Watch, in Egypt, on the merchant marine ship, and in the decades of relentless accumulation that followed, it had produced a man who believed that survival required the complete erasure of who you had been before. He applied this principle to himself. He applied it to Falstaff. He applied it to every company he touched. The St. Louis Magazine writer who chronicled the final chapter of Falstaff posed the question that no one in the Griesediek family could answer with certainty. Was Kalmanovitz a villain? He had bought a dying company, fired loyal workers, destroyed a family legacy, and profited from the wreckage. But the brewing industry was contracting with or without him. Those aging plants were losing money before he arrived. The Griesedieks could not afford to modernize them, and they could not bring themselves to close them. Someone had to do the dirty work. Kalmanovitz simply did it without apology. Joe Jr., reflecting years later, offered no easy verdict. The company was over-leveraged. The creditors were coming. The plants were obsolete. The industry was consolidating around giants who operated at a scale Falstaff could never match. Perhaps the outcome was inevitable. Perhaps the only question was whether the end would come with dignity or without it. Under Kalmanovitz, it came without. Fort Wayne, Indiana. 1990. The Berghoff plant, acquired by Falstaff in 1954, the last brewery standing in a system that had once stretched across 10 cities, brewed its final batch of Falstaff beer and shut down. No cameras recorded the moment. No journalists wrote about it the next morning. A company that had once produced over 7 million barrels a year, employed thousands of workers, traded on the New York Stock Exchange, and fought a case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, ended its manufacturing life in a mid-size Indiana city, quietly without ceremony, as if it had simply run out of things to say. The brand did not die immediately. Pabst Brewing Company, itself now controlled by the S&P Corporation that Kalmanovitz had built, acquired the Falstaff name as a licensed property. Pabst contracted other breweries to produce small quantities of Falstaff beer, keeping the label technically alive on a handful of store shelves in a handful of markets. It was life support, not life. The knight on the can still smiled his Shakespearean smile, but the beer inside was brewed by strangers in factories that had never belonged to Falstaff, sold to customers who mostly bought it out of nostalgia or curiosity. The numbers told the truth. In 2004, Pops sold exactly 168 barrels of Falstaff beer for the entire year, across the entire country. In 1965, the company had produced 7,218 barrels. 40 years later, the figure had fallen to a number so small it barely registered as a rounding error on the industry's ledger. 1,468 barrels, roughly the output of a busy homebrew club. In May 2005, Pabst discontinued production of Falstaff beer permanently. 167 years after Adam Lemp carried the recipe for German lager down the gangplank of a ship and into St. Louis. After the caves, the mansion, the suicides, the Greasedikes, Prohibition, the Supreme Court, the flag that flew upside down, and the man from Poland who took it all apart, the name Falstaff disappeared from the American beer market for good. The physical legacy scattered in unexpected directions. The Galveston Brewery, built in 1895 and closed by Kalmanovitz in 1981, was purchased in 2015 and restored into a boutique hotel and event venue. The old brewing halls converted into climate-controlled storage. The rooftop transformed into a private wedding space. Guests sleep inside walls that once held 1 million barrels of beer and do not know it. In St. Louis, the smokestack of Plant Number 5, the former Columbia Brewing Complex that Falstaff acquired in 1948 and turned into its flagship facility, still rises above the north side of the city. Office workers see it from their windows every day. Most have no idea what it is. The Lemp Mansion at 33-2 Demino Place became a restaurant, a bed and breakfast, and one of the most famous haunted houses in America. Life magazine named it one of the 10 most haunted locations in the country. Every Halloween, thousands of visitors walk through the rooms where William Sr., William Jr., and Charles Lemp ended their lives, searching for ghosts in a house that has more real tragedy than any ghost story could invent. The tunnels beneath the mansion, the same limestone caves where Adam Lemp stored his first barrels of lager in the 1840s, still run deep under the streets of South St. Louis, sealed off, too dark for a lit match to survive. In Cranston, Rhode Island, the Narragansett Brewery Complex sat abandoned for over a decade after its 1981 closure. Demolition began in 1998. The last surviving structure, a trolley barn from the early 20th century, burned in 2005, the same year Falstaff beer went out of production. But the Narragansett brand itself was resurrected that year by Mark Hellendrung, a Rhode Island entrepreneur and former president of Nantucket Nectars, who revived it as a heritage craft beer. Today, Narragansett Lager is brewed under contract in Rochester, New York, and sold in Brooklyn bars where millennials drink it, without knowing that their beer's great-grandmother was murdered by a man from Watch who denied his own name. 2 families built Falstaff. The Lemps created it and destroyed themselves. The Greasedikes rescued it, raised it to greatness, and lost it because they could not bring themselves to do what the industry demanded. Close plants, fireworkers, abandoned the communities that had trusted them. One man tore it apart and turned the wreckage into a billion-dollar fortune that he left to charity, as if money could launder what money had done. The American lager that Adam Lemp brewed in a cave beneath St. Louis in 1838 is still the most popular style of beer in the United States. He won that war. Every cold, golden, effervescent beer poured in every bar and stadium and backyard in America carries the echo of what he started, but his name is on nothing. The Lemp Brewery is a haunted house. The Falstaff brand is a dead trademark owned by Pabst. The Greasedik name survives only in the memories of a family that chose honor over survival and lost everything except the right to say they never betrayed their people. And somewhere in South St. Louis, beneath the streets, beneath the mansions and the empty breweries and the sealed tunnels, the limestone caves are still cold, still dark, still holding the temperature that started it all. No one brews there anymore, but the caves remember.